What happens when faith turns into fanaticism and love becomes something far darker? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most disturbing true stories buried in the history of 1863 Utah, the story of the Lafferty family. They were once respected, devoted, and tightly bound by faith, but what began as spiritual devotion slowly twisted into obsession, forbidden desire, and ultimately madness. Their downfall wasn't sudden. It was a slow corruption of the soul that ended in betrayal, death, and terror that haunted the land for generations. Every fact in this story comes from real historical records, preserved diaries and old testimonies, pieced together through hours of deep research and fact-checking. Before we step into this horrifying journey, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell icon, because finding the truth behind stories like this takes an incredible amount of time, patience, and investigation. Wherever you're watching from, settle in. This is the story of how faith, desire, and darkness destroyed the Lafferty family. The roots of the Lafferty legacy reached deep into the red soil of 19th century Utah, where faith, family, and survival were everything. The year was 1863. A time when settlers braved the wilderness with little more than their beliefs to guide them. Among them stood the Lafferty family, a clan that seemed destined for greatness. Led by patriarch Benjamin Lafferty, they were pioneers, farmers, and devout followers of their faith. To outsiders, they were the perfect example of unity and moral strength. Their sprawling ranch lay just outside a small settlement, surrounded by mountains and desert, a place where every sunrise felt like both a blessing and a challenge. But beneath the picture of purity and piety, something darker had already begun to grow, something that would twist their devotion into something monstrous. Benjamin Lafferty was a man of strict discipline and unshakable conviction. His word was law in the family, and his interpretation of Scripture ruled their daily lives. His wife, Eleanor, was quiet, obedient, and burdened with the weight of raising 7 children under his stern watch. The Lafferty children were taught that obedience to God and to their father was the only path to righteousness. But as the children grew, so did the fractures in their father's vision of perfection. Each of them carried their own hidden desires, curiosities, and doubts, emotions they were told to bury deep in shame. The more Benjamin preached purity, the more temptation festered in the shadows of their hearts. Life on the frontier was unforgiving, and isolation only amplified the family's dependence on faith. Church gatherings were rare, visitors rarer still. Most nights, the Laffertys gathered by candlelight as Benjamin read from the Scriptures, his voice echoing through the wooden beams of their home. But over time, his sermons began to change. They became darker, more personal, laced with warnings of sin, corruption, and demonic influence. He started to speak of visions, dreams that he believed were sent from God himself. In those visions, Benjamin claimed to see the world drowning in sin, and it was his divine duty to keep his family pure at all costs. What began as faith slowly turned into fear. The children, especially the eldest sons, started to believe that disobedience would invite not punishment, but damnation. Neighbors would later recall how the Lafferty home grew silent and cold. The once lively ranch turned inward, as if a shadow had fallen over it. The family stopped attending gatherings, refusing even to trade with nearby settlers. It was said that at night lights glowed from the barn long after midnight, and strange chanting could be heard on the wind. Benjamin began performing what he called purification rituals, claiming they would cleanse his household of temptation. His sons were ordered to fast for days and confess impure thoughts aloud, while his daughters were forced into strict isolation. These rituals, he said, were necessary sacrifices for the salvation of their souls. But in truth, Benjamin's control was crumbling. His eldest son, Samuel, had begun questioning his father's authority, whispering to the others that maybe their suffering wasn't divine at all. It was madness. Samuel's defiance angered Benjamin, who saw rebellion not as disobedience, but as proof that evil had entered his home. The growing tension between father and son marked the beginning of a war that would tear the Lafferty family apart from within. By late 1863, the once-admired Laffertys had become the talk of the valley. Stories spread of Benjamin's strange behavior, of his claims that God had chosen his family for a sacred purpose, and of how his children had begun to act erratically, talking to themselves, refusing food, and waking from nightmares screaming about the fire in the blood. Though no one could have imagined it then, those early signs were the roots of a tragedy that would soon erupt into something far more horrifying. The faith that had once united them would become the very thing that destroyed them, binding them together in a legacy of fear, control, and desire that history would never forget. Faith had always been the heartbeat of the Lafferty family. From the moment Benjamin Lafferty led his family westward into the rough Utah frontier, religion was their compass, their law, and their lifeline. Every sunrise began with prayer, every meal was a ritual, and every hardship was seen as a divine test. To Benjamin, faith wasn't just belief, it was obedience, total and unquestioning. He taught his children that salvation depended on purity of thought and action, that even a whisper of doubt was a betrayal of God. For years, his family followed him faithfully, finding comfort in his certainty. But in time, his devotion would twist into something far darker, a hunger for control disguised as holiness. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Benjamin's sermons at the small meeting house, where local settlers gathered, grew longer, more intense. He spoke of revelation, of the coming of an age where only the chosen would be spared. His neighbors admired his conviction at first, even envied it. But those closest to him noticed the shift in his tone. He no longer spoke of love or forgiveness. His words became sharp, filled with warnings of sin and the threat of eternal damnation. He began insisting that God spoke directly to him in dreams, revealing secret truths that others were too blind to see. His faith was no longer a shared comfort, it was a weapon, and his family became its first victims. At home, Benjamin's strict interpretation of Scripture governed everything. His children were forbidden from speaking freely or questioning his decisions. Even the smallest transgressions, laughter during prayer, a missed verse, a whispered complaint, were punished with fasting or isolation. He claimed he was saving their souls from corruption, but his punishments grew harsher as his faith deepened. His wife Eleanor tried to soothe him, to reason that God was merciful, not cruel, but her words only angered him. He accused her of spiritual weakness, insisting that the devil worked through those who doubted him. Over time, Eleanor's spirit broke under the weight of his conviction, and she retreated into silence, spending her days in prayer and tears. By the summer of 1863, Benjamin began preaching something new, what he called the doctrine of divine desire. He claimed that God's will could be expressed not only through the Spirit, but through the flesh. He spoke of sacred unions, of cleansing the soul by surrendering earthly inhibitions. The language was strange, almost blasphemous, and yet his eldest sons, Samuel and Joseph, listened intently, drawn by both fear and fascination. It was in these private sermons that Benjamin's beliefs began to mutate into obsession. He taught that purity required sacrifice, that the body itself could become an instrument of devotion. The line between faith and temptation blurred, and the house that had once been filled with prayers began to echo with something else, an unsettling tension that no one dared name aloud. Neighbors started to keep their distance. The Laffertys had stopped attending regular services, claiming that the local preachers were corrupt, that their teachings had been diluted by sin. Benjamin said only he could interpret God's will correctly, and that his family must separate themselves from the faithless. From that moment, the Laffertys became isolated, their homestead a private sanctuary for Benjamin's growing delusions. The family no longer interacted with others. They worked their land in silence, closed their doors at sundown, and obeyed Benjamin's every word without question. But within the walls of the Lafferty home, cracks were spreading. Samuel, once his father's most devoted follower, began to sense something wrong. He noticed how Benjamin's eyes would glaze over when he spoke of his revelations, how he would drift between calm prayer and violent outbursts. One night, Samuel woke to find his father kneeling in the dark, whispering frantically to someone who wasn't there. When Samuel asked who he was speaking to, Benjamin replied, "The voice that guides me, the one who tells me what must be done." From that night on, Samuel could no longer pray with the same faith. The family's devotion, once their greatest strength, was turning into their curse. Benjamin's belief that he alone was chosen by God pushed them further into isolation, further into madness. What had started as pure, innocent faith was transforming into blind fanaticism, a storm that no one in the Lafferty household could escape. And in that storm's heart, Benjamin stood convinced that he was the hand of God, ready to reshape his family's fate by any means necessary. As the months passed, the walls of the Lafferty home seemed to grow smaller, tighter, almost suffocating. The isolation had taken its toll. The air inside was heavy, not just with fear, but with something darker. What began as faith and obedience had now become obsession and control. The family's relationships, once bound by love, began to twist into something unrecognizable. Benjamin's so-called doctrine of divine desire had awakened something in his sons that blurred every moral line. Love no longer meant care or compassion. It became a form of possession, an expression of dominance disguised as devotion. Samuel, the eldest, was the first to succumb to his father's influence. He had always been the obedient son, the one who followed orders without question, who longed for his father's approval. But when Benjamin began speaking of sacred unions and the purity of shared blood, Samuel felt something stir in him that terrified him at first. His father told him that earthly love was a reflection of divine will, that God chose certain souls to be connected in ways others could never understand. Those words gave Samuel both purpose and permission. He began to watch his younger sister Clara differently. What had once been brotherly concern became fascination and then obsession. He told himself it was holy, that his feelings were sanctified by God. But deep down, he knew it was something else entirely. Eleanor, their mother, saw the change in her son's eyes. She sensed the unnatural closeness between him and Clara, the way Benjamin would turn away instead of stopping it. One evening she confronted her husband, her voice trembling as she asked how he could allow such behavior under their roof. Benjamin's response was chilling. He told her that she was the one corrupted by the old world's false morals, that the bonds of blood were sacred, and that what God united, man should not judge. It was the first time Eleanor truly realized that the man she had married was gone. The husband she once prayed with had been replaced by a prophet of his own delusions. Clara herself was trapped between confusion and terror. She was only 16, naive and desperate for affection. Her father's teachings had filled her mind with contradictions. Sin and purity, love and damnation, all blurred into one. When Samuel's advances grew more insistent, she didn't know how to resist. Every plea was met with his father's assurance that this was God's will, that her submission would make her holy. The horror of what was happening was buried under the weight of religious manipulation, and silence became her only defense. The younger children, Jacob, Ruth and Mary, could sense the tension but didn't understand it. They only knew that their sister cried often and their mother barely spoke. The house had become divided. Benjamin and Samuel in one corner, claiming divine authority. Eleanor and the younger children in another, praying for deliverance. The dinners grew quieter, prayers longer, and nights colder. Every sound in the dark carried dread. Footsteps, whispers, the faint creak of the door to Clara's room. Outside, rumors began to spread among neighbors who lived miles away. They spoke of strange lights flickering at night from the Lafferty farmhouse, of distant screams, of Benjamin preaching in the fields under the moon, surrounded by his sons. A few brave souls tried to visit, but Benjamin turned them away, claiming that outsiders carried spiritual disease. He said his family was being purified, that soon they would ascend beyond the wickedness of the world. His madness was complete, and now he was passing it on to the next generation. By late autumn, Clara's health had begun to fail. She grew pale and withdrawn, avoiding everyone except her mother. Eleanor, desperate and broken, begged Benjamin to send for a doctor, but he refused. He said her illness was not of the body, but of the soul, a punishment for resisting divine will. It was then that Eleanor made her decision. She would take her children and leave. But before she could act, Benjamin learned of her plan. His fury was uncontrollable. He accused her of betrayal, of conspiring with the devil to destroy their sacred mission. That night, his rage echoed through the house, shattering what little humanity remained. Love had long ceased to exist in the Lafferty home. What was left was control, manipulation, and the perverse belief that devotion justified cruelty. Samuel's obsession, Benjamin's doctrine, and Clara's silent suffering all wove together into a tapestry of twisted desires that no prayer could cleanse. In their attempt to serve God, the Laffertys had built a private hell where love itself had been corrupted beyond recognition. And within that hell, the first signs of the coming tragedy began to take shape, an eruption that would destroy them all. The night of betrayal came with a silence so thick it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. It was the winter of 1863. The snow outside the Lafferty home blanketed everything in white, as if trying to purify the evil festering within its walls. But no amount of snow could cleanse what was about to happen that night. The line between faith and insanity had long vanished for Benjamin and his sons. What began as whispered prayers had turned into chants of divine fury. The family had reached its breaking point, and that night the storm inside them would finally explode into violence. For weeks, Eleanor had been planning their escape. She had quietly packed what little she could carry, food, blankets, and a few coins she'd hidden from Benjamin's watchful eyes. She waited for the right night, one when the winds were loud enough to cover their footsteps, one when Benjamin's prayers dragged long into the dark. That night finally came. As Benjamin and Samuel gathered in the parlor, their heads bowed in what sounded like fervent devotion, but was more like a ritual of madness, Eleanor whispered to her children to get ready. Her voice was shaking, her heart pounding, but she was determined. She would save what was left of her family before it was too late. But madness has a way of sensing betrayal. Benjamin's prayers suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, unnatural. Then his voice, low, trembling with anger, echoed through the room. "Eleanor," he said, "where do you think you're going?" The children froze. Samuel lifted his head, his eyes wide and glassy, as if still half in a trance. Eleanor clutched Clara's hand, her breath catching in her throat. "We're leaving, Benjamin," she said, trying to sound strong. This is not God's will. It's your madness." Benjamin rose slowly, the flickering light from the fire casting wild shadows across his face. "Madness?" he whispered. "You dare call God's revelation madness?" He looked at his sons, then back at his wife. "She's been poisoned," he said, his voice growing louder. "The devil speaks through her." His gaze turned toward Samuel, his most loyal son. "You know what must be done?" Samuel hesitated, trembling. For a fleeting second his old self surfaced, the frightened boy who once looked to his mother for comfort. But Benjamin's voice pressed down like a commandment. "Obedience is the path to salvation, my son. She would destroy us all." That was all it took. The hesitation vanished, replaced by blind devotion. The room erupted in screams. Eleanor tried to shield her children, but Samuel lunged forward. Clara threw herself between them, her voice breaking as she begged her brother to stop. The fire crackled. The candles flickered, and in that moment everything descended into chaos. The betrayal that night wasn't just Eleanor's attempt to flee, it was the family turning on itself, faith turning into bloodshed. By the time the fire died down, the Lafferty home had become a house of ghosts. Neighbors later said they saw smoke rising from the Lafferty farm the next morning. When they finally dared to approach, the sight inside chilled them to the bone. Furniture overturned, blood on the floorboards, and the faint scent of burnt wood. There were no sounds, no movement, only the wind howling through the broken windows. Of the family, few were left alive. Some said Benjamin was gone, disappeared into the woods with Samuel. Others claimed they saw him wandering the hills days later, muttering to himself, his hands still covered in blood. That night marked the end of the Lafferty family as the world had known it. What began as devotion to God ended as worship of power, desire, and delusion. The betrayal that tore them apart wasn't just Eleanor's escape. It was the ultimate act of divine corruption, a night when faith was weaponized and love was slaughtered. Those who later discovered the scene could never fully describe it. It wasn't just the violence that haunted them. It was the feeling that something evil still lingered there, something that had taken root in that home long before the first scream. And as the years passed, locals began to whisper about the curse of the Lafferty homestead. They said you could still hear Eleanor's cries on cold nights, echoing through the canyon. Others claimed to see the ghostly figure of a man wandering the fields, clutching a Bible and weeping for forgiveness that would never come. The night of betrayal had sealed their fate, not just in death, but in eternal damnation. The snow may have buried their bodies, but it could never bury the horror of what the Laffertys had done in the name of faith. The story of the Lafferty family didn't end on that blood-soaked night. It began to spread like a disease, whispered from one town to another across the Utah frontier. People who had once admired Benjamin for his devotion now spoke his name only in hushed tones, afraid that even uttering it might summon something dark. The house where it all happened stood silent, its windows shattered, its walls blackened by smoke. No one dared to go near it. They said the land was cursed, that the ground itself remembered. But what was truly terrifying wasn't just the ghosts said to haunt that place. It was how easily madness had disguised itself as faith, how love had turned into possession, and how the name Lafferty had become a warning passed down through generations. In the months that followed, the remains of the family were buried quietly on the edge of town. The preacher who oversaw the burial refused to speak Benjamin's name during the ceremony, calling him only the Lost One. Some claimed that as the graves were being filled, the wind howled so violently that it ripped the preacher's hat from his head, a bad omen. They said, as if the earth itself rejected the burial. Others whispered that one of the sons, Samuel, was never found, that he had disappeared into the wilderness and lived out his days wandering the mountains, preaching his father's corrupted gospel to anyone unfortunate enough to cross his path. Years later, travelers and settlers passing through the area told strange stories. They spoke of a tall man with wild eyes who appeared in their camps at night, quoting scripture twisted into nonsense, warning of a new flood of fire that would cleanse the world. Some believed it was Samuel. Others thought it was Benjamin himself, somehow alive, cursed to roam for eternity. Every version of the tale ended the same way, with madness, loneliness, and death. The Lafferty name quickly became synonymous with evil. Parents told their children that if they lied or disobeyed, the spirit of Benjamin Lafferty would come for them, whispering God's commands in their sleep. Farmers who tried to settle near the old Lafferty land found their livestock dead by morning, or their wells fouled without reason. The few who stayed long enough spoke of hearing chanting in the distance at night, voices overlapping in strange, ancient prayers. The land itself seemed to reject life, as if marked by the sins that had taken place there. But beyond the ghost stories and legends, there was something even more chilling, a pattern that emerged through time. Historians who studied the case years later found records of descendants who claimed to hear voices, who dreamed of burning houses and blood-soaked altars. Some even returned to the ruins of the old Lafferty home, drawn by an unexplainable pull. One descendant in the early 1900s reportedly took his own life after spending 3 nights there. In his final letter he wrote that the house breathes and it remembers what we did. Generations later, the Lafferty curse still found ways to surface. Families who inherited parts of the land would leave after only a few months, unable to bear the sleepless nights and strange happenings. Doors opened on their own. Whispers echoed through the hallways, and shadows moved where there should have been none. Those who studied the phenomenon scientifically could never explain it fully, but locals needed no explanation. They believed the blood of the Laffertys had soaked into the soil, binding their madness to the earth forever. Even today, the legend lives on. Ghost hunters and thrill-seekers travel to what remains of the old homestead, though few last through the night. Some leave claiming to have seen figures in the window. Others swear they heard a woman's cry drifting on the wind. Every year, as winter approaches, the same season the murders took place, the land grows colder than anywhere else around it. Some say it's the chill of the mountain air. Others say it's the echo of that cursed night when the Lafferty family destroyed itself in the name of faith and desire. And so the story of the Laffertys became more than history. It became a warning, a reminder that devotion without reason can lead to ruin, and that sometimes the greatest evils aren't born from darkness, but from the twisted light of misguided faith. The legacy of the Lafferty family still lingers like a scar on Utah's haunted past, a bloodline bound not by love, but by madness, forever cursed to be remembered as the family that destroyed itself to please a God that never spoke. Long after the night that shattered the Lafferty home, the story refused to fade. It drifted through the valleys of Utah like a cold wind, whispered by travelers, passed between generations, and reshaped with each retelling. But beneath all the superstition, there remained a disturbing truth, a legacy of belief so twisted that even death could not silence it. The surviving members of the Lafferty bloodline carried it like an invisible disease, something that didn't show on their faces but pulsed quietly inside them. Madness, obsession, and guilt became their inheritance, passed from father to son, from mother to daughter, like an unspoken curse that refused to die. In the decades that followed, the Lafferty name was erased from official records, but it survived in rumor and fear. Locals claimed the descendants changed their names and scattered across neighboring towns, trying to escape the weight of their ancestry. But those who carried that blood could never truly escape it. Strange events seemed to follow them. Violent tempers, sudden disappearances, dreams filled with fire and chanting voices. One descendant, Thomas Lafferty, moved north to Idaho in 1889. Within months, neighbors described him as a man plagued by visions. He would speak to unseen presences, muttering prayers in the dead of night. One winter morning, he was found wandering barefoot through the snow, whispering his great-grandfather Benjamin's final sermon word for word. When asked where he learned it, he said, "He told me himself." Other branches of the family met similar fates. In 1912, a woman named Ruth Ann Lafferty, living under a false surname in Wyoming, was reported missing after weeks of claiming she was hearing the call. Her diary, discovered months later in the attic of her abandoned home, was filled with drawings of an old farmhouse, a burning Bible, and the repeated phrase, "The blood remembers." Investigators dismissed it as mental illness, but locals who knew the Lafferty history saw it differently. They believed the madness had never left. It had simply taken new forms, wearing new faces. By the early 20th century, what remained of the Lafferty bloodline was scattered and diminished. Yet their story gained new life as researchers and spiritualists became fascinated with the case. Paranormal investigators visited the ruins of the original Lafferty home, still standing in fragments deep in the Utah wilderness. They reported strange readings, unexplainable sounds, and a persistent sense of being watched. Some even claimed to see figures moving through the fog, shadowy silhouettes that vanished when approached. One team recorded a faint voice repeating a single phrase, "Do you still believe?" The tape was studied, but never explained. The more people delved into the Lafferty family's past, the clearer it became that their curse wasn't just about ghosts or lingering spirits. It was psychological, spiritual, and generational. The original madness that began with Benjamin's fanatical faith had taken root deep within the family's identity. Each generation seemed to reenact his obsession in some way, drawn to religion, isolation, and forbidden desires. It was as if the boundaries Benjamin had broken, between love and control, between faith and sin, had never truly been restored. Even in the modern era, descendants who discovered their lineage described strange experiences. Some reported recurring dreams of being in a candle-lit room, hearing someone whisper verses in an unfamiliar voice. Others said they were drawn to abandoned churches or old scriptures, feeling a pull they couldn't explain. Psychologists called it hereditary trauma, the echo of generational guilt imprinted in the subconscious. But those who lived it believed otherwise. They said the curse wasn't in their minds, it was in their blood. One story from the 1970s stands out. A young man named Daniel, who claimed to be a distant descendant, visited the remains of the Lafferty property with a group of friends. They laughed off the legends, daring each other to spend the night inside the crumbling structure. But as night fell, Daniel began acting strangely, speaking in a low, unfamiliar tone. He recited old passages from Benjamin's journals, which had never been published. The others fled in terror, leaving him behind. By morning, Daniel was gone. His body was found days later at the edge of a frozen creek, his hands clasped in prayer and his eyes open, staring into the sky. These stories became part of the legend, a blend of truth, fear, and superstition. Yet the one thing no one could deny was that the Lafferty name carried weight, as if the past refused to let go. Each new generation seemed destined to replay the same tragedy, to follow the same path of devotion, desire, and destruction. It was as if Benjamin's final act had opened a wound in time itself, one that would never heal. Even now, locals in Utah say that on winter nights, when the air is still and the snow falls silently, you can hear faint murmurs coming from where the Lafferty home once stood. Some say it's the wind. Others swear it's the family, forever praying, forever trapped in their own twisted faith. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of the Laffertys. Not just a curse written in blood, but a reminder of how belief, when corrupted, can destroy not only a family, but every soul that carries its name. As the decades rolled into the early 20th century, the Lafferty story began to shift from whispered legend to documented mystery. Historians, journalists, and curiosity seekers from across the country came to Utah hoping to uncover the truth behind the so-called cursed faith family. What they found was a patchwork of records, inconsistent reports, and fragments of testimonies that seemed to have been altered or erased over time. It was as if someone or something wanted the truth to remain buried. Yet the deeper they dug, the clearer one thing became. The madness that destroyed the Laffertys hadn't ended with Benjamin and his children. It had evolved, adapting to time, infecting each generation differently, but always with the same result: tragedy. In 1924, an amateur historian named Josephine Hale published a short article in a local Utah paper titled "The Lafferty Legacy: God's Wrath or Human Sin." She described the surviving records she'd found: Benjamin's early sermons, Eleanor's letters to her sister, and Samuel's journal, which she claimed to have seen but refused to publish in full. In her article, Josephine wrote that the Laffertys believed their suffering was divine punishment for a sin older than memory, a sin not of action, but of desire. Days after her article went to print, her home mysteriously burned down, taking all her notes with it. Locals said she'd been warned by a man with pale eyes who told her to stop feeding the fire. Some swore they saw that same man wandering the roads near the old Lafferty property days later, humming an old hymn. Josephine survived, but never spoke of the Laffertys again. Over the following years, the legend turned darker. Strange events were reported around the old property: animals mutilated, fires that burned in strange blue hues, and the sound of distant singing on cold nights. A few investigators tried to dismiss it as hysteria, but others left convinced that something unnatural lingered there. In 1936, a team of folklore researchers from a small Utah college set up camp near the site to record their findings. Their notes mention strange occurrences on their second night. Their equipment failed, compasses spun wildly, and one member began muttering biblical verses in his sleep. When they broke camp, the lead researcher wrote in his journal, "The place is wrong. Not haunted, infected." By mid-century, the Lafferty name had become synonymous with madness in Utah's folklore. Teachers used it as a cautionary tale about blind faith. Preachers mentioned it in sermons as a warning against false prophets. But despite being treated as legend, the family's bloodline continued quietly in the background. Records show that at least 5 descendants lived in the state throughout the 1950s, though all under changed surnames. 3 were later institutionalized for severe psychological disturbances. One of them, a woman named Margaret Collins, claimed that at night she could see her ancestors praying in the walls, and that they wanted her to finish what was started. Doctors dismissed it as delusion until she was found dead in her hospital room, her hands clasped as though in prayer, and a single word scrawled on the wall in ash, "Obey." As the 1960s came, the Lafferty curse attracted a new kind of attention. Paranormal investigators, journalists, and even filmmakers flocked to Utah, drawn by the story's chilling mix of religion, madness, and mystery. But the deeper they probed, the more the pattern repeated. Each investigation ended in fear, destruction, or disappearance. A television crew in 1971 attempted to film a documentary at the Lafferty ruins, but the project was abandoned after 2 members quit, claiming to have seen someone praying in the fields despite no one else being there. The remaining footage, recovered years later, contained distorted audio of a voice whispering, "Faith binds us. Faith buries us." By then, the legend had outgrown its origins. Some believed the Lafferty curse was not spiritual, but psychological, an intergenerational trauma born from violence and control. Others insisted it was something far darker, something that fed on belief itself. Whether one viewed it as divine punishment, inherited insanity, or supernatural corruption, the pattern was undeniable. Those who bore the Lafferty blood were drawn back to the same fate, as if compelled by forces older than faith, and through it all, one symbol kept appearing, etched into stone, burned into wood, even scratched onto mirrors, a cross made of 2 intersecting circles, said to represent the merging of flesh and faith. No one knew where it originated, but experts who studied it noted its resemblance to ancient alchemical symbols for transformation through suffering. The same mark was reportedly found carved into Benjamin Lafferty's Bible, into Samuel's coffin, and on the lintel of the original house. It became the emblem of their downfall, a reminder that faith, when twisted, can forge monsters instead of saints. By the time the century turned, the Lafferty name had become a ghost story, but one that refused to die. The family's story wasn't just about the past, it was about the eternal tension between belief and madness, about the dangerous power of conviction untempered by compassion. The Laffertys had built their lives on the idea that they were chosen by God. In the end, they were chosen by something far darker, something that demanded worship not through prayer, but through pain. Even now, on certain cold Utah nights, locals claim they can see faint lights flickering where the old farmhouse once stood, hear murmured prayers carried on the wind. Whether it's the ghosts of the Laffertys or the echo of their sins, no one can say. But everyone who's lived in that valley knows one thing. Belief can save you, or it can destroy everything you love. And for the Lafferty family, it did both. By the late 20th century, the Lafferty family's curse had transcended mere folklore and begun infecting modern minds. What was once spoken of in whispers around fires had become the subject of books, documentaries, and late-night radio shows. Yet for those who traced their bloodline back to Benjamin and Eleanor Lafferty, it was not entertainment. It was a shadow they could never escape. The descendants, now scattered across Utah and neighboring states, carried the weight of a surname they dared not speak. Many changed their names, some moved far away, and a few lived in quiet denial. But history has a way of resurfacing, and in the 1980s, it did, through one man who believed he had been called to finish the divine work his ancestors had begun. His name was Aaron Lafferty, or at least that's what he claimed before changing it to Elias the Redeemed. He appeared seemingly out of nowhere, preaching a blend of scripture, prophecy, and apocalyptic visions. His followers were few at first, a handful of lost souls seeking purpose in rural Utah, but his charisma was undeniable. Those who met him described him as soft-spoken but intense, his eyes filled with the same unsettling light that old witnesses had once described in Benjamin. He spoke often of cleansing, of sacrifice, and of binding blood to purpose. For those familiar with the Lafferty legend, his words were chillingly familiar. It was as if the curse had been reborn, carried forward by a man convinced he was chosen. By 1986, Elias's small group had isolated themselves in a remote settlement near the same valley where the original Lafferty home once stood. They called it New Zion. Locals began reporting strange chanting in the early mornings, fires that burned through the night, and the smell of sulfur drifting on the wind. A delivery driver once claimed to have seen figures kneeling in a circle around a burning cross made of wood and animal bones. When questioned later, Elias described their rituals as acts of renewal, a way to purify the corrupted blood of their lineage. Authorities visited once after reports of missing livestock, but found nothing but silence and ash. The following year, tragedy struck again. In February 1987, 2 members of Elias's group were found dead near the property line, their bodies arranged in the shape of the double-circle cross that had haunted the Lafferty story for more than a century. Elias claimed it was an accident, a test of faith gone wrong. But when investigators searched the grounds, they found disturbing writings carved into the walls of the group's meeting house. Phrases like, "The blood must answer," and "faith is flesh." Days later, Elias vanished, leaving behind only a journal written in a mixture of biblical verse and incoherent rambling. The final entry read, "They whisper still. I hear them in the soil." The promise was never fulfilled. He was never found. After the disappearance, the property was abandoned, but its story didn't end there. Over the years, hikers and urban explorers who ventured into the area claimed to experience hallucinations, voices calling their names, sudden drops in temperature, and visions of faceless figures praying in the dark. One investigator described the site as a living wound in the earth, a place where belief itself seemed to rot. Experts who examined the location found traces of human and animal blood mixed into the soil, along with remnants of symbols drawn in soot. Forensic psychologists later theorized that Elias may have succumbed to the same psychosis that plagued his ancestors, religious mania born from generations of guilt and repression. But the timing, the symbols, and the eerie similarities were too perfect to ignore. It was as if the curse had waited patiently, feeding on silence until it found a new host. In the 1990s, several journalists attempted to revive interest in the case, labeling it the return of the Lafferty curse. One article even linked the events at New Zion to a series of ritualistic killings that occurred across the state, though authorities dismissed it as sensationalism. Yet every investigator who studied the case seemed to suffer strange misfortunes: car accidents, house fires, sudden breakdowns. One writer described feeling followed by prayers for weeks after leaving the valley, waking in the night to the sound of murmured voices near her bed. It was as if the Lafferty story didn't want to be told, as if it consumed those who tried to unravel it. By the early 2000s, the legend had become part of Utah's darker folklore, spoken of in true crime circles and occult communities alike. Scholars called it a psychological phenomenon, religious experts called it blasphemy, and paranormal enthusiasts called it proof of generational haunting. But the truth lay somewhere in between. Whether the curse was real or symbolic, one fact remained. Every generation of the Laffertys had suffered the same fate: spiritual decay followed by destruction. Their faith, once meant to bring salvation, had become their undoing. And so the story continued to ripple through time, carried on by whispers, old photographs, and the faint marks left behind by those who believed too deeply. Some say the curse will finally end when the last descendant dies. Others claim it will live on as long as people speak their name, as long as someone, somewhere, believes. For now, the valley remains quiet, overgrown and forgotten. But when the wind blows just right, it carries with it a low, rhythmic sound, like voices reciting a prayer that never ends. Those who have heard it swear it's saying the same three words that echo through every chapter of the Lafferty family's history: bound by blood. As the years passed and the story of the Lafferty family faded from newspapers and books, the curse itself seemed to retreat into silence, but silence has never meant peace. Beneath that quiet, something still pulsed. Those who lived near the old valley began to notice that the land never quite healed. No grass grew where the farmhouse once stood, and even after decades of rain and sun, the soil remained dark and lifeless. Locals who dared to explore the ruins often spoke of an overwhelming feeling of being watched, as if the ground itself was aware. Some claimed that at dusk, if you stood perfectly still, you could hear faint whispers rising from the earth, prayers, apologies, or perhaps warnings. The curse, it seemed, had not died with Elias Lafferty. It was merely waiting for the next believer. In 2013, a university research team from Salt Lake City decided to conduct a psychological and environmental study on the Lafferty property, hoping to separate myth from reality once and for all. Their approach was scientific. They tested the soil, installed motion sensors, and monitored sound levels through the night. The first 2 nights were uneventful, though several members reported feeling anxiety without cause. On the 3rd night, the team's equipment malfunctioned. Cameras picked up static, and the audio recorders captured a faint humming sound, rhythmic and low. When enhanced, the sound resembled human chanting, though no one was within miles of the site. A graduate student later described seeing a figure kneeling in the field when reviewing infrared footage. But when the team returned to the site, there were no footprints, only a burned patch of earth, in the exact shape of the old Lafferty cross. The university quietly pulled the plug on the project, labeling it inconclusive, and sealed the results. Yet a leaked report surfaced online a year later. It included photographs of symbols carved into nearby stones, symbols that hadn't been there before. Their design matched the same double-circle cross that haunted the Lafferty legacy for more than a century. The report concluded with an unnerving statement. Whether psychological imprint, environmental anomaly, or cultural residue, the site retains a persistent sense of presence. It is as though belief itself has etched a memory into the land. For those who believed in the curse, it was proof that some things never die. They evolve. That same year, a woman named Rebecca L., claiming to be a distant descendant of the Laffertys, appeared on a paranormal podcast. Her voice trembled as she spoke about her family's past, saying she had been drawn back to Utah by dreams of voices calling her name, of fire and scripture. She said she had seen the mark of the double circle appear on her mirror in condensation, over and over, every morning. When the host asked her if she believed the curse was real, she paused before answering, "It's not a curse anymore. It's a calling." A few weeks later, the podcast reported that Rebecca had gone missing. Her car was found near the Lafferty Valley, engine still running, but there was no trace of her. Only her shoes were found, placed neatly beside a burned patch of ground. In the years since, the site has become a forbidden place. Locals warn travelers not to go near it after sunset. Ghost hunters, thrill seekers, and YouTubers have all tried to capture evidence of the curse, but many end up leaving early, shaken by what they describe as a feeling that something ancient is listening. Some footage shows flickering lights or shadowy figures that move in unnatural ways. Others record the faint sound of chanting, though there's never anyone visible. What's most chilling is that no matter how many years pass, the same words seem to echo in every recording, murmured in a mix of English and an older dialect. The blood must answer. Historians now view the Lafferty story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of fanaticism and generational trauma, but even the most rational among them admit that the consistency of the strange phenomena is hard to dismiss. Psychologists who've studied surviving family members note patterns of shared hallucinations, inherited psychosis, and religious obsession. Yet every attempt to rationalize the curse leads to more questions than answers. Why do the same symbols reappear? Why do unrelated people report the same dreams? And why does every investigation into the Laffertys end abruptly, with silence, fear, or disappearance? Some now believe that the Lafferty curse is not supernatural at all, but something deeper, a psychological contagion born from faith twisted beyond recognition, a belief so strong it shaped reality around it. Others argue that the Laffertys stumbled upon something truly dark, something not meant to be worshipped, and that whatever they invoked still lingers, feeding on those who remember. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: the line between madness and devotion remains razor-thin, and the Laffertys crossed it long ago. Today, the valley lies abandoned. The ruins of the house have been reclaimed by weeds and dust, yet nothing ever fully disappears there. Sometimes, on moonless nights, Drivers passing through the area report seeing faint lights in the fields, moving slowly as if part of a silent procession. Others hear hymns carried on the wind, soft, mournful, and inhumanly old. No one knows if they're echoes of the past or something still alive beneath the earth. But everyone who's heard them says the same thing. Once you hear that song, it never leaves you. It follows you home. The story of the Lafferty family ends where it began, in faith, in blood, and in madness. Some say their curse was a punishment. Others say it was a choice. But one truth echoes through time. When belief turns to obsession, it doesn't just destroy a family. It creates a legacy that refuses to die. And somewhere, even now, that legacy is still whispering, waiting for another believer to listen.